The villagers gasped as Richard, the wealthy cocoa farmer, stood before the people of Duma village, holding hands with his young mistress, Sylvia, in front of his kneeling wife, Grace. The sun was blazing hot, but the air had turned cold. Without blinking, Richard declared, "I divorce you, Grace. Leave my house today. Sylvia is my wife now." Grace trembled, her eyes wide in disbelief. The same man she had stood beside through storms and sweat, now cast her away like old cloth. Women wept. Men shook their heads. Children hid behind their mothers' wrappers, sensing something terrible had just happened. But the shock didn't end there. 3 months later, Grace returned. But she was not the same woman. Her head was held high, her steps calm and sure. And in her arms, she carried a strange wooden box wrapped in red cloth. No one knew what was inside. But from the moment she stepped back into Duma, strange things began to happen. Cocoa trees withered overnight, goats stopped eating, and Richard's once booming farm started to rot from the roots. Then one night, Sylvia disappeared. No one saw where she went. That was the night Grace opened the box. But what she pulled out was not a thing of this world. Now, let's go back to the beginning. It all started 2 years before that unforgettable day. Grace was known all over Duma village as a hardworking and kind-hearted woman. She woke every day before the sun, tied her scarf tightly, and marched to the farm with her husband, Richard. Together, they turned a single plot of cocoa land into the biggest farm in 3 villages. She cooked for the workers. She managed the accounts. She even sold some of the cocoa herself in town markets, walking long dusty roads with baskets on her head. Richard would boast about her strength and loyalty to anyone who would listen. But soon, things began to change. Richard started staying out late, wearing fancy clothes he had never liked before. He bought a motorbike and spent most of his days in town instead of on the farm. Grace didn't question it at first. She believed her husband was just enjoying the fruits of their labor. But one afternoon, she followed him. What she saw crushed her heart like dry leaves. There, in a small shop on the edge of town, was Richard laughing and feeding fried meat to a young woman with soft skin, painted nails, and long shiny hair. They laughed like children playing in rain. Grace's feet went cold. Her stomach twisted. But she did not cry. She just turned back home. That night, she served Richard dinner like nothing happened. But her hands shook slightly as she poured his water. She watched as he ate, smiling, unaware that the woman who gave him everything was now sitting with a broken heart. Weeks passed. The whispers began. "Have you seen Richard's new lady? He no longer walks with Grace. I heard he bought land for her." Still, Grace said nothing. She worked the farm as usual. She smiled at the workers. But in her heart, a storm was building. Then came the day of the great festival in Duma. It was a time when all villagers danced, sang, and wore their finest clothes to thank the gods for the harvest. Richard and Grace had always led the dance for married couples. But that year, Richard danced with Sylvia. He didn't even look at Grace. That night, after the festival fire died down, Richard told Grace to pack her things. "I want a new life," he said coldly. "You've become old. Stiff. You remind me of work, not joy. Sylvia is young, fresh. I want to feel alive again." Grace blinked. "You're joking." "I'm not," he said. "You can keep a few things. I've given Sylvia the house. But I built this life with you," Grace whispered. Richard shrugged. "Then go build another." That was the last night Grace slept in her home. She walked away with only a sack on her back and tears in her eyes. The village women cried for her, but they were too scared to speak against Richard. He was too rich, too powerful. Grace stayed with an old aunt in the outskirts of the village. Days passed. Then weeks. She didn't come to the markets anymore. She didn't go to the farm. Some said she had gone mad. Others said she had gone to beg the gods. But no one knew the truth. Grace had traveled far. Deeper into the forest than anyone had dared in years. She went seeking an ancient woman known only as Mama Nuru, a forgotten priestess who once helped queens and warriors before the white men came. It took her 9 days and 9 nights. Her feet bled. Her throat cracked from thirst. But she found Mama Nuru, sitting beside a river that glowed under the moonlight. The old woman did not speak at first. She only stared at Grace. Then she said, "Why have you come?" "My husband cast me away," Grace said. "For another woman." "That is common," Mama Nuru replied. "But I want justice," Grace said. "Not revenge. Just balance." Mama Nuru nodded. "Then you must carry the burden of truth." "What does that mean?" "You will know," the old woman said, reaching into a dark cave behind her. She came out holding a small wooden box wrapped in red cloth. "Take this. Open it only when the time is right. When your heart is calm, and your spirit is firm." Grace took the box. It was warm, almost like it breathed. Mama Nuru smiled. "Remember, The one who causes pain shall drink from its cup. And so, Grace returned. She arrived in Duma one quiet morning, barefoot but glowing. She walked past everyone without a word, heading straight to the land she once called home. No one stopped her. Not even Richard. He stood frozen as she passed. But from that day, strange things began to happen. The farm's leaves turned black. Birds no longer sang near the house. And Sylvia began waking up screaming at night, holding her ears, saying she heard voices. Still, Richard refused to send Grace away. He laughed. Let her play with her wooden toy. It means nothing. But then Sylvia vanished. And Grace opened the box. What came out was not human. And it was coming for Richard. Richard stood in the center of his once proud cocoa farm, now nothing more than a ghost field. The trees were dry skeletons, their leaves crumbling like ash. Birds no longer perched. Insects no longer buzzed. Even the wind seemed afraid to blow through the branches. But the silence wasn't what made Richard sweat. It was the box. The wooden box Grace had brought back. That cursed box. He had seen her open it 3 nights ago, on the same night Sylvia vanished without a sound. One moment she had been in the house, brushing her long hair in front of the mirror. The next moment, gone. The brush was still on the table. Her slippers were still by the bed. But Sylvia was nowhere. The only thing left behind was a black feather. One single, long, oily feather, resting on her pillow. Since that night, Richard hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard whispering. The whispers came from the shadows. They spoke his name. Sometimes, he would see a figure just standing at the edge of his vision, tall, dark, wearing a mask of wood and bone. But when he turned, nothing would be there. It was driving him mad. He had gone to the priest. The priest said to pray. He went to the herbalist. The herbalist said to beg Grace. But Richard was too proud. Grace is just a bitter woman, he told himself. She's playing tricks. That's all. But deep down, he was shaking. Because Grace had not said a single word to him since she returned. Not once. And that scared him more than anything. She moved like the wind, quiet, certain, and untouchable. She wore white every day. She smiled at the villagers. Children followed her, and old women knelt when she passed. Some even said she no longer walked on the ground, that her feet didn't leave footprints. Richard wanted to believe they were just stories. Until the 3rd night. That was the night the knocking began. It started soft. Just a gentle tock on the door of his bedroom. He thought it was the wind. Or maybe a loose branch. But when he opened the door, there was nothing. The next night, the knocking came again. Louder this time. And again, nothing there. But on the 5th night, it wasn't knocking. It was scratching. Long, slow, clawing scratches against the door. As if something, or someone, was dragging its nails along the wood, waiting. That was the night he found the 2nd feather. This one red. Planted in the center of his bed. He screamed. He ran through the village in the middle of the night, half-dressed, shouting Sylvia's name. Villagers watched from their windows as the mighty Richard, once the strongest man in Duma, now cried like a child lost in the forest. Grace, watching from her aunt's porch, said nothing. But in her eyes, something flickered. Not joy. Not revenge. Something deeper. A quiet ache. A distant sorrow. Because even now, after everything, part of her still remembered the man Richard used to be. Before greed. Before Sylvia. Before pride ruined him. But she also knew, justice was not hers to stop now. The box had been opened. And what was inside? Had already chosen its path. Earlier that same day, before the scratching began, something strange had happened in the market. An old woman no one had seen before came selling beads and charms. She sat quietly by the edge of the market, her eyes hidden behind a scarf. When people asked her name, she only said, "I know what you've seen. I know what's coming." She didn't speak to anyone, except Grace. The moment Grace walked past, the old woman called out, "Daughter of Pain. Keeper of the box." Grace stopped. The market went quiet. The old woman stood and handed Grace a single object, a mirror made of broken glass and bound with tree bark. "See what you must," she whispered. "But beware. The truth eats those who aren't ready." Grace took the mirror and walked away. She didn't look into it. Not yet. But that night, after Richard had run mad through the village, she sat by her window, held the mirror in her hand, and whispered, "Show me." What she saw made her gasp. Because the box had not only released what haunted Richard. It had revealed a secret. A secret even Grace didn't know. It showed her a memory, one hidden deep inside the shadows of her past. A fire. A crying child. A broken promise. And Richard. Richard, holding something in his hand. Something he had buried long ago. Grace covered her mouth. "No," she whispered. "He lied about everything. Tears fell down her face. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just a mistress. Richard had hidden something much worse. And now, the box would uncover it all. Meanwhile, in Richard's house, things were getting worse. He had locked every door, covered every mirror, burned incense until the walls turned black. But it didn't stop. Voices kept calling. At first, they whispered. Then they screamed. He saw Sylvia's face in the mirror, eyes wide, mouth open, as if she were shouting from behind glass. He saw shadows dancing on his ceiling. He heard drums. And then, the box appeared on his bed. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't seen Grace. But there it was, sitting on the same spot Sylvia had vanished from. Wrapped in red. Waiting. His hands shook as he reached for it. He had no choice now. He had to know what was inside. Maybe if he understood it, he could end it. Maybe he could beg. He opened the box. Inside was a small bag made of leather, tied with a string. And inside that bag, a letter. A letter in Grace's handwriting. It read, "You took my love and broke it. You took my home and burned it. You took my life and gave it to another. But the gods are not blind. Open the mirror, Richard. See who you truly are." There was also a mirror. Not like the one Grace received. This one was black. Deep, still as death. Richard held it up. At first, he saw nothing. Then, his own face appeared. But it was not his face. It was twisted. Rotten. Covered in crawling insects. His eyes were empty. His mouth stitched shut. He dropped the mirror, screaming. The lights exploded. The floor cracked. And from the broken mirror rose a figure. The same one he had seen at the edge of his vision. The one with the bone mask. It stepped forward. And whispered, "You buried more than love, Richard." Before Richard could speak, the creature raised its hand. And the ground beneath him split wide open. The ground opened with a sound like thunder cracking through stone. Richard screamed as the floorboards of his room split apart, forming a wide, dark hole beneath his feet. He tried to run, but the shadows moved faster. Invisible hands grabbed his legs and pulled him to the edge. "No! No!" he cried, clawing at the wooden floor, his nails breaking and bleeding. But there was no one to hear him. Everyone in the village was asleep. Except Grace. She woke with a jolt, her heart racing. She looked out of her window. The night was still. Too still. The moonlight painted everything in silver, but there was no wind, no crickets, not even the hoot of an owl. Only silence. She clutched the broken glass mirror the old woman had given her, staring into it. "Show me where he is," she whispered. The glass shimmered, then clouded over. When it cleared, she saw Richard, dangling over the hole, screaming, fighting against the thing in the bone mask. It towered over him now, taller than any man, cloaked in shadows and dust. Its eyes burned like fire behind the mask. Grace's hands trembled. She didn't know whether to cry or to let it happen. But something inside her whispered, "You must see this through." Back in Richard's room, the masked figure leaned in close. "Do you know why I've come?" it hissed, its voice like dead leaves rustling in dry wind. Richard gasped. "Please. I don't know what I did. I made a mistake, yes, I chased youth, but I didn't." "You buried her, Richard," the voice roared. "And you thought no one would ever know." Richard froze. His mouth opened. Then shut. The mask tilted, studying him. "You forgot that secrets rot. And you forgot that love is not something you throw away." The creature raised a hand. From the shadows behind it, a figure stepped out. Richard's blood turned cold. It was Sylvia. Her face was pale. Her eyes hollow. Her lips stitched with golden thread. She floated, yes, floated, over to him, her feet never touching the ground. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. Tears streamed down Richard's cheeks. "What did you do to her?" The creature leaned close. "You did this." "No. No, I didn't kill her. I loved her." "Did you?" the voice asked. "Then why did you do the same thing to her that you did to the first?" And suddenly, Grace's face flashed in Richard's mind. Not how she looked now, but how she looked 10 years ago. Young. In love. Hopeful. That's when the memory came back like a blade slicing through his thoughts. He had stood by a small grave in the forest. A tiny one. The rains had just started. The earth was soft. His hands were shaking. And beside him was Grace. She was screaming. Crying. Holding something in her arms. A baby. No, not a baby anymore. It was too still. Too cold. The child had died of fever. But Richard, oh, Richard had blamed her. "You weren't watching him," he had shouted. "You were supposed to take care of him." Grace had collapsed beside the grave, sobbing. But Richard didn't comfort her. He turned and walked away. He never forgave her. Never held her again the same way. Never healed from the pain. Instead, he buried it. And over time, that pain turned into resentment. Resentment turned into distance. And that distance gave space for another woman. Sylvia. The creature saw it all in Richard's mind. And it nodded. You were never cursed, Richard. You were just running from your own sins. The floor beneath him cracked wider. Flames flickered from below. Richard screamed again. Please. Don't do this. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Meaning does not undo action, the voice said coldly. Then Sylvia stepped forward, placed her hand on Richard's chest, and pushed. He fell into the hole, screaming into the blackness, swallowed by the past he refused to face. And just like that, the room went silent again. In the morning, the villagers found Richard's house empty. No broken floor. No sign of a fight. No blood. Just feathers. Black, red, and gold, scattered across his bed. And the wooden box, closed once more, sitting neatly on his pillow. When the news spread, some said Richard ran mad and fled the village. Others said he was taken by spirits. But the elders knew better. They said the box had judged him. And the box does not make mistakes. Grace, meanwhile, stood alone by the riverbank that evening. She had buried the mirror under a sacred tree. The wind rustled gently through the leaves now, as if thanking her. Her heart was heavy. She had not wanted this. She had wanted healing. Closure. Peace. But justice came the way it always does. With a price. Suddenly, a familiar voice behind her said, "It is not over." Grace turned sharply. The old woman from the market stood there again, barefoot, untouched by time. "What do you mean?" Grace asked. The woman pointed toward the sky. Storm clouds were gathering. "Justice is only the beginning," she said. "Now comes truth." "What truth?" Grace whispered. The old woman's eyes narrowed. "The child." Grace's heart skipped. "What about the child?" she asked slowly. The old woman turned away. "Not all graves stay closed forever." Then she disappeared. Grace stood frozen, a cold wind blowing against her back. And from deep in the forest behind her, came the sound of a child's laughter. The laughter echoed through the forest like a forgotten song, sweet, high, and soft, but it didn't bring joy. No. It brought chills. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her legs refused to move. The wind whispered through the tall grass beside the riverbank, and still the laughter danced through the trees behind her, circling her like mist. Then it stopped. And everything went still again. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the forest edge. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and silence. But Grace knew what she had heard. It was no trick of the wind. That laugh, she would know it anywhere. It was her son's. David. The baby she had lost 10 years ago. The one they buried with trembling hands, in the soft earth during the season of sickness. The one who had died of fever in her arms. Grace fell to her knees, gripping the ground. Her heart was beating too fast, her mouth dry. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, it can't be. He's gone. I buried him. I buried him." But the wind answered her with a whisper that carried the same voice, "Not all graves stay closed forever." That night, Grace did not sleep. She sat by her window, clutching her wrapper tightly, eyes wide open, listening to every creak and rustle. The wooden box sat beside her bed, closed, but pulsing faintly, as if something inside was breathing. The same box that had ended Richard's reign of pride and cruelty. Now, it was stirring again. In the morning, she returned to the old tree where she had buried the mirror. It was a sacred baobab, one that elders said could hear the truth. She dug carefully and retrieved the mirror. The broken glass was now darker than before. The tree's roots had wrapped around the edges, like fingers trying to keep it hidden. Grace sat at the base of the tree. "I need to know," she whispered. "Is my son really gone?" She held the mirror up. Fog swirled across the surface, then cleared. And what she saw made her drop the mirror and cover her mouth. Because there he was. David. But not as a baby. He was a boy now, no more than 8, dressed in white, with big brown eyes that looked straight through the glass into her soul. He wasn't smiling. He looked sad. And behind him stood Mama Nuru, the ancient priestess. Her hands were on David's shoulders. Her eyes locked onto Grace's. "You are not finished yet." Grace sobbed. "Why is he there? Why is he not at peace?" The mirror flickered. Suddenly, a new image appeared. Richard. Not in fire. Not in shadows. He was in the forest, alive. Barefoot, wild-eyed, stumbling through the trees like a madman, mumbling to himself. The black-feathered creature walked behind him, never touching him, just following silently. He was not dead. He had been taken. Punished, yes. But not destroyed. The mirror spoke once more in Mama Nuru's voice, "There is more to the story. You were told the child died of fever. But the gods remember differently." Grace shook her head. What are you saying? The mirror went black. She dropped it. Her hands trembled. The wind howled louder. She had been told David died in her arms. That he stopped breathing one cold night, and that there was nothing anyone could do. But now, the world was telling her a different story. And the only person who could give her the truth was no longer in this world. Or so she thought. Later that day, the village buzzed with new rumors. I saw Richard, one man shouted in the square. In the forest. Like a ghost. He looked right at me, then vanished. Another swore they saw Sylvia near the river, standing on the water. A third claimed the cocoa trees were growing again, but their pods were bleeding. People whispered Grace's name in hushed tones. Some feared her. Others revered her. The elders finally called a meeting beneath the iroko tree. Grace, said the chief, an old man named Bamadil with eyes like dusk. You carry something with you. Something the earth respects. But now, the spirits are stirring too loudly. You must tell us what is coming. Grace stood before them, calm. The truth, she said. The truth is coming. And with that, she turned and left. She returned home and packed her bag. She was going back to the forest. To Mama Nuru. To her son. She walked deep into the woods, guided by memories and whispers. Days passed. She ate wild berries, drank from clean streams, and followed the sun. Finally, on the 7th night, she reached the river that glowed under moonlight, the same place she had first met Mama Nuru. But this time, Mama Nuru was waiting. So was David. Grace fell to her knees. My child. David looked at her with sad eyes. You didn't know, Mama. You didn't see. Grace reached for him, but her hand passed through him like mist. Mama Nuru stepped forward. He is caught between two worlds. Not dead. Not living. His spirit has been hidden, locked, because someone feared what he might become. Grace's eyes widened. What do you mean? The old woman looked toward the moon. Richard made a deal. Long ago. After your child died, yes, from fever, he buried something with him. A curse? Mama Nuru nodded. He sought power. The kind that comes from loss. The kind that gives riches but asks for blood. Grace gasped. He used our son? Mama Nuru's face darkened. Not directly. But he bound his pain to the land. That's why the farm grew so fast. That's why money came so easily. It was never just hard work. It was grief, turned into greed. Grace couldn't breathe. She fell to the ground, clutching her chest. And now, she asked. What happens now? Mama Nuru looked at the child. David's image flickered. If you wish to set him free, you must undo what was done. How? You must find the tree. Grace frowned. What tree? The one Richard buried the charm beneath. The one that sits at the center of the farm. The oldest tree. Grace's eyes widened. She knew that tree. She had planted it with Richard when they first married. They had called it the love tree. And now, that was where the truth was buried. She stood slowly, her resolve returning. I'll go, she said. Tonight. But Mama Nuru raised a hand. No. Not alone. This next part is not for the living alone. She turned to David. The boy stepped forward. And for the first time, Grace felt him touch her. His fingers were cold. But they were real. His voice was soft as he said, I'll go with you, Mama. And in that moment, Grace knew. The final battle wasn't against Richard. Or even Sylvia. It was against the secret buried beneath the love tree. And the thing that now guarded it. They turned and began walking back through the forest. But far behind them, hidden among the trees, something stirred. Its eyes glowed gold. Its wings stretched wide. And its whisper slithered into the night, you should have left the box closed. The journey back to Duma was long, but Grace felt no fear. David walked beside her, not quite solid, not quite spirit. He shimmered like mist under moonlight, a quiet presence, small but powerful. His little hand gripped hers. For the first time in 10 years, Grace's heart felt whole and broken at the same time. They didn't speak much. There were no words for what they were preparing to face. As they passed through the thick trees and winding paths, the world around them began to change. The wind grew colder. Birds stopped singing. Even the moon dimmed behind heavy clouds. By the time they reached the outskirts of Duma, the village was wrapped in an unnatural silence. Something was waiting. That night, Grace stood at the edge of the farm she once built with her own hands. The same land she had tilled, planted, and prayed over. The same land Richard turned into gold, by offering his pain to the earth. And now it stood in ruin. Half of the cocoa trees were dead. The soil smelled like metal. The sky above the farm was darker than the rest of the village, as though the clouds feared to pass over it. Grace walked forward, David beside her. With each step they took, the wind picked up. A low hum began to fill the air, like 1,000 voices murmuring secrets in the dark. They stopped at the tree. The love tree. It stood taller than any other tree on the farm. Its bark was cracked. Its branches twisted toward the heavens like arms begging for forgiveness. But it was dying. Its roots curled above the soil like writhing snakes. Grace reached out and touched the trunk. And the ground shook. Suddenly, the earth split open in a perfect circle around the tree, revealing something buried at its base. A small clay pot. Sealed with red wax. Covered in strange symbols. Grace dropped to her knees and brushed the dirt away with her bare hands. David stood beside her, silent. She knew this was it. The charm Richard had buried. The secret that had given him power. She hesitated. "Are you ready, Mama?" David asked softly. Grace looked into his eyes. "I've been ready for 10 years. She broke the seal. At once, the air turned heavy. A scream, loud and ancient, ripped through the sky, shaking the branches above. The charm cracked open, releasing a gust of dark wind that spiraled into the sky like smoke. From the shadows behind them, something rose. Tall. Wretched. It looked like a man, but wasn't. It had Richard's face, but twisted and hollow. Its mouth hung open, full of ash and worms. Its eyes were white and glowing. Feathers jutted out from its back, black, red, and gold. The creature took a step forward, and the earth burned beneath its feet. Grace stood and faced it, heart pounding. "What are you?" she demanded. The thing tilted its head. "I am what love becomes when twisted by greed." Its voice was many voices. "Richard fed me his sorrow. He gave me your child's spirit, unknowingly, when he cursed the land with his pain. I grew inside the roots of this tree, waiting for him to rot." Grace shook with rage. "Then why are you still here? He's gone." The creature smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Because it was never just about him. You see, Grace, you opened the box." She froze. "No," she whispered. "You asked for justice," it hissed. "You called on the balance of the world. And now you must finish what you started." David stepped between them. "Leave my mother alone." The creature looked down at him with something like amusement. "You're not meant to be here, little one. He belongs with me." Grace shouted. "He's my son." The creature bared its teeth. "He belongs to the spirit realm now. But you belong here. With your pain. And your box." It lunged. Grace screamed and threw her arms over David. But instead of striking her, the creature stopped inches away, growling. Its form began to flicker. Behind it, a light appeared. Blinding. Pure. From the trees stepped Mama Nuru. Her eyes burned white. She raised her hands, and a staff appeared in them, made of bone, wrapped in golden cloth. "You will not take her," she said. The creature growled. "You gave her the box." "I gave her a choice," Mama Nuru replied. "She chose justice. But you took more than you were given. Now you must answer." The staff struck the ground. Lightning flashed. The creature screamed, writhing, as golden fire wrapped around its body. It tried to flee, but the tree roots reached up and dragged it down. Back into the earth. Back to where it came from. The charm cracked into pieces. The soil healed. The tree sighed like it had been holding its breath for a century. The wind stopped. Grace fell to her knees, holding David, sobbing. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." But Mama Nuru shook her head. "No, child. It's not over." Grace looked up, eyes wide. "Why? What more is left?" Mama Nuru's voice was soft now. "You broke the curse. But the boy." She looked at David. "He still doesn't belong here." Grace's heart sank. "No. Please. Let me keep him." David looked up at her with wet eyes. "Mama, I want to stay, but I can feel it. I don't belong in this world anymore." Tears streamed down Grace's face. "Please. I've only just got you back." Mama Nuru stepped forward and knelt beside her. "There is a way," she said. "But it comes with a cost." Grace looked up. "Anything. You must give up the box. Forever. You must never seek justice through it again. No vengeance. No secrets. No more asking the spirits to fix what man has broken." Grace blinked, heart heavy. "That's it?" Mama Nuru nodded. "It means you live without revenge. Without protection from what others may do. But it also means your son may walk freely again, only once, for one life." Grace held David tightly. She didn't hesitate. "I give it up." The box appeared between them. Grace reached out and closed it with both hands. The moment the lid shut, a flash of light exploded from within. And when it faded, David stood solid. Real. Alive. He touched his chest and looked at his hands. "Mama. I'm really here." Grace laughed through tears and hugged him tighter than she ever had. Mama Nuru smiled gently. Then turned to walk away. "Wait." Grace called. "Will I see you again?" Mama Nuru paused. "You will feel me in the wind," she said. but I am not needed anymore. You've brought balance." And with that, she vanished into the trees. Grace and David stood beneath the love tree, the moon now shining bright above them, the farm slowly breathing back to life around them. But just as peace began to return to the land, a scream echoed from the village. A woman's scream. Not one of fear, but of pain. And the voice cried out, "She's back. She's come back." Grace froze. David clutched her hand. They turned toward the village. And from the shadows of the path, a figure emerged. Sylvia. Her body torn. Her eyes burning. And behind her? The box. Wide open. Sylvia stood at the edge of the village, her feet bare and muddy, her once beautiful dress torn to shreds. Her hair clung to her face like wet vines. Blood stained the corner of her lips, but she did not seem wounded. Her eyes burned like twin suns, wild, glowing, and far from human. The villagers screamed and scattered. Children were swept into huts, doors slammed shut, and windows were barred. No one dared approach her. No one dared breathe too loudly. Because they remembered. They remembered she had vanished without a trace. And now, she had returned. With the box. Open. Grace stood rooted to the spot, clutching David's hand. "She brought it back," she whispered. David's voice trembled. "But how? You closed it." Grace's heart raced. She looked toward the forest, toward where Mama Nuru had vanished. "I gave it up. I gave it up." Sylvia's head tilted slowly. Her gaze landed on Grace. And she smiled. But it wasn't Sylvia's smile. It was something else. Something wearing her face. She raised her arm, and the box floated beside her, open like a mouth. From within it, a voice hissed, "One was set free. One must return." The ground trembled. Crows flew from the trees, screeching. David flinched. Grace stepped in front of him. Sylvia took a step forward. With every step she took, the earth darkened. The grass withered. The air grew heavy. The sky, once bright with stars, became a swirling black cloud. Then, without warning, Sylvia screamed. A scream so loud and sharp it cracked the air. Then her body jerked violently, as if something inside her was trying to tear its way out. And suddenly, she dropped to her knees. The box fell beside her, slamming shut. And everything went quiet. Grace didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Sylvia's trembling form. Then, slowly, Sylvia raised her head. Her eyes were no longer glowing. They were filled with tears. "Help me," she whispered. Grace blinked, confused. "Sylvia?" Sylvia nodded weakly. I didn't know what he did. I didn't know what he gave up." Grace stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Sylvia clutched her chest. "Richard. Before he gave me everything, he took me to the forest. Said we had to seal our future. Said it was just a blessing. A bond." Her voice cracked. "He made me drink something. And I saw things, horrible things. I saw a boy trapped in the roots of a tree. I saw you crying. I saw him, whispering to shadows." Grace felt her knees weaken. Sylvia sobbed. "When the box opened, I didn't run. I thought it would give me power. I thought I could be more than just the mistress. I wanted to be something." She looked up, her face twisted in guilt. "But the box doesn't give, it takes. It pulled me down into a place where time doesn't move. Where voices never stop. It made me watch him, Richard, wandering in madness, begging to die." Sylvia began to shake violently, like the memory itself was too much to carry. "I tried to come back. I fought to come back. But something followed me. Something came with me. It used me to open the box again." She looked at Grace. "I didn't mean to bring it back." Grace knelt beside her. "I believe you." Sylvia collapsed into Grace's arms, sobbing like a child. David stood nearby, watching with wide eyes. "Is it still inside her?" he asked. Grace didn't answer. Because she could feel it. The presence. The same one that had haunted Richard, that had dragged Sylvia into the darkness. It was not done. The box might have closed. But its hunger remained. Grace helped Sylvia to her feet. "We have to finish this. For real, this time." Sylvia nodded. "Tell me what to do." They took the box and walked straight to the center of the village, where the great Irako tree stood. The elders had already gathered, watching with wary eyes. Chief Bamadil stepped forward. "What is this? What is she doing here?" Grace looked up at him. "She's not the enemy." The old chief narrowed his eyes. "She vanished for moons. She returns, the sky turns black, and the dead rise. Now you say she is innocent?" Grace turned to the crowd. "Listen to me. What's happening here isn't just about Sylvia or Richard or me. It's about the choices we've all made. The things we've allowed. The secrets we've ignored." She held up the box. "This box feeds on pain. It offers justice when you're desperate. Power when you're weak. But it never gives freely." The villagers murmured. Grace continued, "It took from me. It took from Sylvia. It took from Richard. It even tried to take my son. But no more." She stepped forward and placed the box at the base of the Irako tree. "I will end it." Sylvia looked at her, alarmed. "How?" Grace met her eyes. "I'm going in." Sylvia gasped. "No. No, you can't." David shouted, "Mama, no." Grace knelt and held his face in her hands. "My love. You were brought back to life. I will not let this curse take someone else. Not again." David's lip trembled. "But what if you don't come back?" Grace smiled gently. "Then I will be with you in the wind." Just like she said. She turned to Sylvia. "You escaped it once. You survived. Guard the village. Protect David. If I fail, burn the box." Sylvia nodded, swallowing her fear. Then Grace took a deep breath and opened the box one final time. A blinding light shot out, wrapping around her like golden vines. Then, whoosh, she vanished. Gone. Just like that. Sylvia and David stood frozen, staring at the space where Grace had been. The box slammed shut. The village held its breath. Inside the box, Grace fell through darkness. She landed in a world that wasn't a world, a swirling storm of broken memories, shadows, whispers, and fire. Faces drifted through the mist. Richard's face. Sylvia's. David's as a baby. Then, the creature appeared. But it was different now. It was bigger. Stronger. And it had a new face. Grace's. It smiled with her lips. Spoke with her voice. "I am the justice you called," it said. "The pain you buried. The fire you lit. I didn't ask for you," Grace said, rising to her feet. "But you opened the box," it replied. "You opened it, and so you became it." Then it charged at her. Faster than lightning. And in the heart of the darkness, Grace screamed. Grace hit the ground with a deafening crack, but not of bone. It was the cracking of time. She lay in a world of mirrors, each one spinning around her in a spiral of endless reflections. In one mirror, she saw herself as a young bride, smiling beside Richard beneath the love tree. In another, she saw herself holding David's tiny hands. In another, she saw herself now, broken, determined, fighting something older than memory. The creature, her reflection made flesh, stood tall above her. It had her face, her voice, but none of her soul. "I am the you that you tried to hide," it said. "The rage you buried. The sorrow you swallowed. I am not you," Grace spat, rising. "You are. And you will become me. This is your final lesson. Justice, when fed by pain alone, becomes vengeance." It raised a twisted version of the box, glowing red-hot. Grace knew then, this was not just the spirit of the box. It was what the box created inside her. It fed on her silence, her heartbreak, her desire to see Richard fall, Sylvia suffer. And when she opened it, it began shaping itself in her image. The only way to defeat it was to forgive. "No," she whispered, eyes flooding. "Not because they deserve it. But because I deserve peace." The creature sneered. "Forgiveness is weakness." "No," she said, standing tall now. "Vengeance is weakness dressed in power." She turned toward one of the mirrors, the one showing Richard walking away from the grave of their child. Her lips trembled. "I forgive you, not for what you did, but so I can be free." The mirror glowed. Another mirror showed Sylvia laughing beside Richard. "I forgive you, for not knowing the pain you helped cause." That mirror glowed. Another mirror showed herself, crying on a cold floor, night after night. "I forgive me, for staying too long. For hoping too hard. For loving too deeply." The mirrors pulsed with golden light. The creature shrieked. "No! You are mine. You brought me to life." But the light from the mirrors surged, wrapping around the box, pulling it from the creature's grasp. It floated between them, open, but instead of darkness pouring out, it was light. Warm. Pure. Grace stepped forward, unafraid. And she did something no one had ever done. She stepped into the box. The world erupted in a blaze of white. In Duma, the villagers had gathered around the closed box at the base of the Irako tree. Sylvia held David close, her arms trembling. The box had been still for an hour. The chief ordered guards around it. The priests burned incense. No one knew what to do. Then, it began to shake. Gently at first. Then violently. The lid burst open. A whirlwind of golden light exploded outward, knocking everyone to the ground. Leaves flew into the air, and the tree itself shimmered with life. And there, rising from the center of the light, was Grace. Her white wrapper flowed around her like wings. Her eyes were closed. Her feet hovered inches above the earth. The box floated beside her, still open, but nothing poured from it now. No screams. No shadows. Only stillness. She opened her eyes. Everyone gasped. Because they were no longer just Grace's eyes. They carried centuries. She floated to the ground. Sylvia ran to her, tears falling. You came back. You actually came back. Grace looked at her softly, then pulled her into an embrace. I found the end, she whispered. And the beginning. David rushed forward, and Grace knelt to hold him tightly. It's done, she whispered into his ear. You're safe. The chief stepped forward. What are you now? Grace stood slowly and looked at the villagers. I was a woman who asked the spirits for justice. She looked at the box. I found that justice can become poison, if your heart is not clean. She held the box up. Now I return it. She walked to the center of the farm, to the love tree, and dug deep into the earth. She placed the box into the soil, and it sank on its own, swallowed by the earth that had once been cursed. She stepped back. The tree bloomed. Right before their eyes, green leaves sprouted from every branch. Flowers burst open like laughter. The ground hummed with life. Even the cocoa pods that had withered weeks ago now hung heavy and golden. The land was healed. But just as everyone exhaled in relief, a low rumble shook the earth. David clutched his mother's hand. What now? Grace looked around. But this time, it wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from beneath the village. The elders turned as the ground near the river cracked wide open. A deep voice echoed from the depths. You have unbalanced what should have remained hidden. From the river's heart, a figure rose. It was not of this world. Not a ghost. Not a spirit. But something older. Older than the box. Older than Mama Nuru. A being of stone and fire, wrapped in gold chains that hung from its arms like broken promises. It towered into the sky, with eyes like melted bronze. The villagers screamed and fled. Grace stood her ground, shielding David. The being looked down at her. You broke the bond of blood and earth, it said. I broke a curse, she replied. It was not a curse. It was a seal. Grace blinked. What? The being's voice shook the trees. The pain that gave Richard power was only the key. But what he unlocked was a prison. One I have slept in for 1,000 years. Grace's heart pounded. Then you're the one who was sealed away. The creature raised a hand. The ground cracked again. All this time, it said, you thought the box was the source. But the box was only a door. Grace took a step back. What are you? She asked. The being grinned with molten teeth. I am what comes after justice. I am what wakes when truth is too heavy. I am the weight of all unburied pain. I am, it roared, raising both hands to the sky, the reckoner. And in that moment, every grave in the village shook. Bones whispered. And the land held its breath. The sky split open as the reckoner rose fully from the heart of the river, its golden chains dragging through the soil like snakes made of thunder. The villagers scattered in all directions, falling to their knees, crying out, some speaking in tongues, others unable to speak at all. Animals ran wild. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight. The wind howled like it had gone mad. Grace stood frozen at the base of the love tree, clutching David, shielding his body with her own. What have I done? She whispered. Sylvia stumbled beside her, eyes wide, staring up at the towering creature. You didn't do this, she said, her voice shaking. Richard did. Long before either of us understood what he had touched. The reckoner turned its molten gaze upon them. Its face was unreadable, a mask of ash and cracked stone, its mouth jagged and glowing. Fire pulsed in the grooves of its chest like rivers of lava, and when it moved, the earth beneath it melted into glass. You called justice, it thundered, and justice came. Its voice echoed from every corner of the village. But now the scales must balance. The blood that was offered to bind me has been undone. The chains are broken. I am awake. Grace stepped forward, trembling. What do you want? The reckoner raised one massive arm and pointed toward the love tree. Return the boy. Grace's heart stopped. David clung to her leg. No, she said, voice hoarse. No, I gave up the box. I gave up vengeance. I paid the price. The reckoner's voice turned colder. You paid with words. You paid with promises. But the boy was bound in a pact sealed with life. And you, woman, you unsealed it. I broke the curse, she shouted. He's free now. You broke a lock, the reckoner boomed, stepping closer, but did not destroy the prison. One soul must return. Or many shall suffer. Behind them, the earth cracked open, and dark smoke hissed from the ground. A scream echoed from the village square. Then another. Then dozens. Sylvia gasped. Grace, look. People were falling. Collapsing. The old. The young. Those closest to the river began choking on the air itself. The reckoner was not bluffing. Grace fell to her knees. Please, please, take me instead. The reckoner was still. Then it spoke. You were not the one bound. Grace's hands shook. Then bind me now. The creature tilted its head. Would you trade your soul for the boys? Yes, she said without hesitation. I would. David cried out. No, Mama. No, don't leave me again. Grace turned and cupped his face. You are my heart, David. But if this is the only way to make things right, I have to do it. Sylvia knelt beside her, tears falling freely. There has to be another way. Grace looked at her. Then help me find it. Suddenly, a sound rose in the air, soft at first, like wind through dry leaves. Then louder. It was chanting. Rhythmic. Ancient. From the far side of the village, the elders emerged, cloaked in white, led by Chief Bamadil. In their hands, they carried staffs carved with symbols older than the village itself. We remember the first fire, the chief shouted. The reckoner paused. We remember the oath of stone and seed. We remember what was bound beneath the river, not by one man, but by a council of many. The reckoner's eyes narrowed. You were not meant to wake. You are not justice, Bamadil continued, you are wrath. You were sealed by balance, by will, not by blood. You were bound by a promise, and we are still the keepers of that promise. The reckoner took a step back. Then bring forth the seal. The elders began to chant louder now, forming a circle around the love tree. Their voices lifted into the heavens, shaking the very sky. One by one, they stabbed their staffs into the ground, forming a glowing circle of ancient energy. The tree responded. Its roots lit up with golden fire, crawling outward in sacred patterns. The light pulsed beneath the reckoner's feet. The beast roared. Grace stood within the circle, still holding David. Sylvia joined her. The villagers slowly returned, many falling to their knees in prayer. Others joined the chant. Mama Nuru's voice echoed across the wind. Justice is not destruction. Justice restores. Bind him again, not with pain, but with unity. And Grace understood. She raised her voice. I call on the spirits of the land. I call on the women whose hands built homes. I call on the men who planted trees. I call on the children who laughed beneath this sky. Come. Help me bind what should not walk free. The villagers answered. Their voices rose together in a mighty storm of sound, chants, songs, prayers, and cries. The reckoner screamed, clawing at the sky as chains of light wrapped around its arms, its legs, its throat. No, it bellowed. I am owed blood. You will have peace instead, Grace said. And then David stepped forward, his small hands glowing. He looked the reckoner in the eyes. I forgive you, he said softly. The chains glowed hotter. I forgive my father. The chains locked into place. I forgive the past. And with those words, the reckoner collapsed into a whirlwind of gold and ash, sucked back into the heart of the earth. The cracks sealed. The smoke vanished. The sky cleared. It was over. This time, for real. The love tree bloomed brighter than ever. A wave of warmth swept through the land. The cocoa trees straightened. Birds returned. The wind sang. Grace fell to her knees, overwhelmed. David hugged her tightly. Sylvia sat beside them, stunned but alive. Chief Bamadil stepped forward, tears in his eyes. You did what no one has ever done. You gave justice a soul. The village celebrated that night. Not with drums or fire. But with silence. With peace. They lit candles for the lost. They planted new seeds for the future. And under the love tree, Grace whispered her final vow. No more boxes. No more revenge. Only healing. But even in peace, not all was still. Far away, at the edge of the forest, where the river curved like a serpent, a shadow moved. It watched the village. It smiled. And it whispered. Even light casts a shadow. The village of Duma basked in its first true peace in years. The wind carried no whispers. The love tree stood tall and proud, its golden leaves fluttering gently in the breeze like blessings falling from the sky. Children laughed again. Farmers sang in the fields. The cocoa pods grew full, and the earth no longer groaned under secrets. But peace, like fire, must be watched. Because even when the flames die, the embers still glow. And far beyond the village, at the bend of the river, where the light no longer reached, a pair of eyes watched from the darkness. The shadow that had whispered at the end of the reckoner's fall had not left. It had simply waited. And now, it stirred. Not a creature. Not a beast. Not even a spirit. It was something worse. A memory. A remnant of the first binding. When the reckoner had been sealed 1,000 years ago, part of it had broken off and sunk deep into the land, a sliver of wrath, a seed of vengeance. That seed had grown silently, fed by every injustice, every secret, every buried pain. And now, someone had found it. Her name was Zara. A stranger. She arrived in Duma without sound. One day, she was simply there. Dark robes. A veil over her face. A walking stick carved from blackwood. No one saw her enter. No one saw her come down the road. No one knew where she stayed. But they began to notice her at the edge of crowds. At the markets. By the river. Just watching. At first, the villagers assumed she was a wanderer, maybe someone seeking peace after war in the north. Duma had always welcomed lost souls. But then the small things started. Animals disappearing. Wells drying faster than they should. Children waking with nightmares and scratches on their arms. The elders grew uneasy. Grace noticed her, too. The woman's presence made the air shift. Who is she? David asked one afternoon, as they watched Zara standing beside the love tree, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to it breathe. I don't know, Grace said. But I feel something in her. Something, unfinished. That night, Grace had a dream. She stood at the center of the village, surrounded by fire. The love tree was burning. Villagers screamed. And Zara stood at the heart of it all, holding the broken box, somehow reformed, its lid wide open, a black mist spiraling from within. But when Grace reached for the box, it disappeared. And Zara said only one word. Balance. Grace woke in a cold sweat. She knew the dream wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. The next morning, she went to the elders. She's not what she seems, Grace told them. There's something inside her. Something that doesn't belong in this world. Chief Bamadiel frowned. Do you think she is tied to the Reckoner? No, Grace said, voice low. Worse. She might be what was left after him. A shell. A seed. Something that slipped through the cracks. The elders debated. Some wanted her watched. Others wanted her banished. But before they could decide, Zara disappeared. Her hut was empty. Her footprints led to the river. And then vanished. Grace knew she had gone to the forest. So she followed. She walked deep into the woods again, David beside her, now older, stronger, and more aware of the world's dangers. I have to come, Mama, he said. If this is about the Reckoner, I have to see it through. They found Zara by the same glowing river where Grace had once met Mama Nuru. But Mama Nuru was not there. Only Zara. She stood ankle-deep in the water, eyes closed, arms outstretched. Dark vines grew from the ground and wrapped around her wrists like bracelets. And in her hand? Was the box. Whole. Untouched. Impossible. You broke it, David whispered. How is it back? Grace stepped forward. That's not the same box. Zara turned slowly, removing her veil. Her face was not evil. It was sad. Young. Beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, terrible, powerful, inevitable. I was born from silence, she said softly. From the breath between screams. From the cracks in justice. Grace frowned. Who are you? Zara looked at her. I am not the Reckoner. I am what he left behind. A question no one answered. A pain no one named. She held up the box. This isn't the same door you closed. This is the other side. Grace took a step back. What do you want? Zara looked down at the water. What everyone wants. Balance. You think you ended the curse. You think you restored the land. But nothing truly ends. You sealed one door. But what about all the others? She pointed toward the horizon. There are more boxes, Grace. Scattered across the world. Some still buried. Some already opened. Grace's blood ran cold. You're lying. Zara's eyes gleamed. Am I? You know this in your bones. You feel it in your dreams. The box answered your pain. But others have been crying longer. Louder. More dangerously. She stepped forward. And now, they've heard each other. Grace looked down at the box in Zara's hand. It didn't pulse like the other. It was still. Silent. But she could feel it. Something was inside. And it was listening. What happens if you open it? She asked. Zara smiled, almost gently. Then the others will open too. David whispered, why would you do that? Zara's eyes flicked to him. Because the world is full of pain. And no one wants to carry it anymore. They want to give it to something. Let it fight for them. Grace shook her head. That's not justice. No, Zara said. It's balance. She raised the box. Grace ran forward. But she was too late. Zara opened it. And the wind died. All at once. The world stopped breathing. No sound. No motion. Then, a sound rose from far, far away. Like a drum. Then another. And another. And Grace knew. Other boxes were opening. All over the world. And what they unleashed was just beginning. The drums did not stop. They grew louder with each passing second, like thunder rolling across the land. But it wasn't thunder. It was something deeper. Ancient. Waking. Grace stood frozen as the box in Zara's hands pulsed with a dark red glow. From within it, shadows slithered out like ribbons in water, twisting in the air, reaching skyward like fingers grasping for something just out of sight. The river hissed and steamed beneath Zara's feet. David grabbed his mother's hand tightly. "Mama," he said, eyes wide, "something is coming." Zara did not speak. She stood with arms spread, face tilted to the sky, letting the shadows dance around her body. The box floated now, open and spinning slowly, as if it were searching. And then, from far away, a second pulse echoed in the air. Another box. Then another. Then another. Grace's heart dropped. She wasn't lying. "No," Zara said softly, not turning. "I never was. You sealed one curse, Grace. But there were 12. Grace stepped forward, rage and disbelief boiling in her voice. "You opened a door without knowing what's behind it." Zara finally looked at her. Her face was calm. "I don't need to know. I only need the world to feel. Justice cannot belong to one village, one land. What you did here, others have needed for generations. Now they will have their turn." "This isn't justice," Grace snapped. "It's chaos." Zara's eyes flashed. "No, Grace. It's balance. You called it when you opened your box. You cracked the silence. The silence was never going to last forever." And as if to prove her words, the ground trembled beneath them. From the water, dark figures began to rise, shapes formed of shadow and bone, cloaked in mist. Some were tall and twisted. Others crawled on all fours. Each had a different mask. Each carried a different pain. David stared in horror. "What are those?" Zara whispered, "They are the children of pain. The ones left behind by the boxes before yours. The ones whose justice was never delivered." One of the figures stepped forward. It had no eyes. Only a stitched mouth and hollow cheeks. It pointed at Grace. It rasped. Grace fell to one knee, clutching her head as a sharp pain tore through her skull. Visions of other lands, other boxes, other lives flooded her mind. She saw a young girl chained beneath a mountain, praying for release. A mother screaming into an empty cradle. A village burned to silence, its story never told. The boxes were all opening. And they knew her name. Zara stepped forward, her voice stronger now, filled with a strange kind of power. "You became a beacon, Grace. The one who dared to face what no one else would. And now they come to you, not to hurt you, but to ask, will you help us find justice too?" Grace rose slowly, still gripping David's hand. "I'm no savior." "No," Zara said. "You're something more dangerous. You're willing." The sky above twisted. Clouds blackened. And suddenly, boom, a strike of red lightning split the heavens, hitting the earth miles away. Then another. And another. Far in the distance, the villagers of Duma saw the flashes. They huddled together in silence, sensing that the peace they had fought for was unraveling. Sylvia stood at the edge of the cocoa farm, feeling the tremors in her bones. "They're opening," she whispered. The elders gathered at the love tree once more. Chief Bamadil gripped his staff. "We've seen this before," he said grimly. "Long ago. When the first box was opened, before time had a name." An old priestess stepped forward. It was not just the reckoner that was sealed. It was a world. A world of broken oaths and forgotten cries. Grace returned to the village at dawn, exhausted, her eyes darker than ever. David walked beside her, silent. Zara did not follow. She vanished the moment the box opened, melted into shadow, like smoke on the wind. But the damage was done. "What now?" the chief asked. Grace didn't answer immediately. Then she looked at them and said, "We need to prepare. Because what's coming isn't a curse. It's not a demon. It's a choice." "A choice?" asked one elder. Grace nodded. "Every person, every village, every soul who ever suffered in silence, they're going to be offered the same box I was. Some will resist. Others will open it." She looked to the horizon where the red lightning flashed again. "And some already have." That night, the village built a great fire in the center square. Not to dance, not to celebrate. But to gather. To remember. Grace stood before them all and told them everything. About the reckoner. The sacrifice. The forgiveness. And Zara. She held up a hand, and the villagers went silent. "We were the first," she said. "The first to break the cycle. But that means we'll be the first to be tested again." "What can we do?" someone asked. "We remember," Grace said. "We stay together. We do not seek the box. We do not trade pain for power. We live in truth, not vengeance." Sylvia stepped forward. "And if others bring it to us?" Grace looked at her. "Then we stand. Not as victims. But as those who've already walked through the fire." And then, as the fire crackled and villagers leaned on each other for warmth, something strange happened. The air shimmered. And Mama Nuru appeared. Her spirit walked through the flames, glowing like moonlight on water. Grace's heart leapt. "You came back." Mama Nuru smiled. "Only for a moment. To tell you, you are not alone." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" Mama Nuru turned to the east. There are others. Like you. Across the world. Those who closed their boxes. Those who still carry the burden. When the drums call, you must find each other. The balance cannot be restored by one hand. She turned back to Grace. It takes 12. Then she vanished. The villagers gasped. David looked up at his mother. There are more of you. Grace nodded slowly. I need to find them. The sky burned red again. And far beyond Duma, in places no one dared speak of, 12 lights sparked into being, 12 boxes, 12 guardians, 12 reckonings. Grace closed her eyes. And took her first step into the next journey. The journey began with silence. Not the peaceful kind Duma had come to know after the reckoner was sealed, but the kind that hangs in the air just before a storm breaks, when the birds vanish and the wind forgets its direction. Grace knew that silence. She had felt it once before, standing before the first box. Now she would face more. 12 boxes had been created long ago, each sealed in a different corner of the world, each tied to a kind of pain the earth itself could not bury. Duma had opened the first. Zara had awakened the rest. But not all had been opened yet. And Grace had to find the ones who held the others. Mama Nuru's final words rang in her soul, it takes 12. 12 to restore balance. 12 to stand when the boxes come for the world. Grace didn't wait. Within days, she had gathered her things. David insisted on coming. Sylvia too. You'll need me, Sylvia said simply, standing at Grace's door with a satchel on her back and a spear in her hand. You saw how easy it was for the box to use me once. If another box finds me again, I want to face it on my feet, not on my knees. Grace didn't argue. Deep down, she was grateful. The three of them set out from Duma before sunrise, heading east first, toward the highlands where a woman named Amara was said to have survived a dream that lasted 10 years. A woman whose voice could shake stone. A woman rumored to have sealed a box, and forgotten it. But as they traveled, they saw signs that the world had changed. Villages burned in silence. Towns full of people who didn't sleep, only wandered the streets whispering to themselves. One boy, no more than 7, approached Grace in a village called Zuru, clutching a small wooden toy box. They said if I open it, I'll see my mother again, he whispered. Grace fell to her knees, took his hand, and said, you don't need the box to remember love. You need to live. She held him until he cried. That night, they buried the toy under the moon. And continued on. 2 weeks into their journey, they reached the highlands. The air was thin, the trees taller, older, as though they'd seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. It was there they found Amara. She did not live in a hut or a house. She lived in a cave carved into a cliff face, surrounded by wind chimes made of bone and metal, each one singing a different tune when the wind passed through. Grace approached her slowly. Amara? The woman who emerged was not what Grace expected. Young. Eyes like fireflies in dusk. Hair wrapped in a long red cloth, trailing behind her like smoke. She looked at Grace, then at Sylvia and David. I've been waiting for you, she said, voice like cracked glass. You know why we're here, Grace replied. Amara nodded. I saw you in my dream. The woman who walked through fire and came out holding light. Grace was taken aback. Mama Nuru said we must gather the 12. Do you have one of the boxes? Amara's gaze darkened. I buried it, she said. But it still sings to me when I sleep. David stepped forward. Have you opened it? I wanted to, Amara confessed. When they came for my son and left me with nothing. I wanted the world to hurt like I did. But I didn't open it. I screamed into it. And it listened. Then it went silent. She looked at Grace. But now it's humming again. The others are calling it. Grace nodded. Then we must seal it. Truly. But Amara shook her head. No. We must awaken it the right way. Sylvia frowned. What do you mean? Amara stepped back and pulled a cloth from the wall of the cave. Behind it, carved in the stone, were symbols, 12 to be exact. Each glowed faintly, one brighter than the rest. The boxes were never meant to be curses, Amara said. They were meant to hold pain safely. To stop it from spreading. She touched one symbol. But when they are opened by vengeance, they rot. They twist. They become what we fought in Duma. What you call reckoner. David stared. So we're not just fighting evil. We're restoring something? Yes, Amara said. And each of the 12 must be brought together, not to destroy, but to complete the circle. Grace understood now. The boxes were not created to cause destruction. They were created to contain it. To share the world's pain. To stop anyone's soul from carrying too much. But the world had forgotten. And pain, when sealed too long, screams to be heard. Amara agreed to join them. But as they prepared to leave, they were ambushed. It happened at dusk. A low whistle cut through the trees. Then, Thunk, an arrow landed in the ground near Grace's feet. They turned to see 4 figures emerging from the mist, each wearing a wooden mask painted in ash. Their bodies were wrapped in gray cloth, and each held a weapon pulsing with dark energy. They didn't speak. But Grace knew who they were. Box bearers. But not the kind she hoped to find. These ones had opened their boxes. And been consumed by them. One raised a hand, and his voice came in a hollow rasp. We are the Broken 12. We walk with no names. We do not seek justice. We are justice. Amara stepped forward. You were never meant to open them alone. That's not how the circle works. Another hissed. The circle is broken. We complete it in blood. Without warning, they attacked. Grace pushed David behind her. Sylvia threw her spear. Thud, it struck one attacker through the shoulder, but he didn't fall. The box bearers moved like shadows, fast, flickering, vanishing and reappearing mid-strike. Grace shouted, they're not alive. They're echoes. Amara began to sing, her voice vibrating with ancient power. The sound struck the attackers like a wave, forcing them back. But the lead attacker raised his hand. The box in his palm opened. And from it, black smoke poured out, forming a beast with 100 eyes and no mouth. The trees caught fire. The wind screamed. And Grace saw clearly. This was not just a battle. This was a war. And it had begun. The beast rose like a mountain made of nightmares, shapeless, faceless, built from every whisper of pain the wind had ever carried. It had no bones. No eyes. Just the constant shift of black smoke and glowing cracks of red that pulsed with rage. 100 eyes opened across its body, blinking out of sync, watching everything and nothing at once. The air thickened. The trees moaned. The stars above seemed to dim, as if even the sky did not want to witness what was coming. Grace pushed David behind her, her arms wide. Sylvia gritted her teeth and pulled another spear from her back. Tell me that's not what I think it is. Amara stepped forward, eyes glowing with songlight. It's not the Reckoner, she said, but it's made in the Reckoner's image. A mimic. A parasite. It feeds on the emotions of opened boxes. And the Broken 12, they serve it. The beast opened something that looked like a mouth, more like a tear in space, and screamed. The sound bent the trees backward. Birds dropped from the sky. Grace felt the scream in her bones. One of the masked attackers charged her, blade raised high. Clang! Sylvia blocked it with the shaft of her spear, spun, and kicked him to the ground. You're not taking her. Another bearer lunged at Amara, but Amara didn't flinch. She whispered a word and thrust her hand forward, sending out a wave of sound that shattered the attacker's mask and sent him flying into the trees. Still, they came. All 4 bore the strength of those who had handed their souls to their boxes. All 4 were lost. David! Grace shouted, run. Find the circle of chimes. Stay there. David hesitated. Go! Grace barked. He ran. The beast turned its gaze of blinking, endless eyes toward him, sensing something. No! Grace screamed, rushing forward to draw its attention. The ground beneath her cracked. Flames seeped from the roots of the trees. The box carried by the lead attacker floated above his hands, open and pulsing with dark red light. Amara joined Grace's side, her voice rising into song. The mimic must be sealed, she shouted. It's not bound to a box, it is the echo of all boxes opened in rage. Grace's mind raced. Then how do we stop it? Amara's voice dropped low. With the truth. Sylvia joined them. I've got truth and 10 spears, let's go. The beast lunged. Grace closed her eyes. And remembered. She remembered the Reckoner. She remembered her child. She remembered the first time she was betrayed. And the moment she forgave. She opened her mouth, and didn't scream. She spoke. I name the pain. I name the weight. I name the wound. The box in the attacker's hands trembled. I name the silence. I name the shadows. I name the grief. The beast froze mid-lunge. Grace's voice became thunder. You are not the balance. You are the broken dam. The wind shifted. Amara began singing again, harmonizing with Grace's words. Sylvia stood between them, spinning her spears in wide circles, holding off the Broken 12. Then, a ring of fire exploded around the mimic beast. Not flames of destruction, but cleansing fire. The kind that purifies. Grace stepped into it. I bind this mimic not with fear, not with death, but with truth. The box above the attacker's hands cracked down the middle. The mimic let out a final cry, and shattered. The smoke burst outward in a spiral, then vanished like mist at sunrise. The air cleared. The trees stood still again. And the 4 box bearers fell to their knees, their masks dissolving, their faces stunned, empty, free. Silence returned. Real silence. Grace fell to her knees, exhausted. Sylvia helped her up. Amara knelt and placed a hand on the soil. The earth is listening again, she said. David rushed back from the trees and threw himself into his mother's arms. You did it, he whispered. Grace looked at him. No, she said. We did it. Amara stood slowly, looking at the horizon. But this was only one. There are more. More mimics. More broken box bearers. The boxes opened by rage will continue to rot unless we gather the 12. How many have you found? Sylvia asked. Amara turned. Including me? 4. Grace is 1. There is a man in the salt deserts. A child in the frozen north. A twin born under eclipse. They're waking. They're calling. Grace's jaw clenched. Then we go to them. We gather the circle. We seal every mimic. And we bring the boxes back to their purpose. Sylvia looked at the shattered box on the ground. What do we do with this? Amara smiled. We bury it in song. They dug deep under the love tree and placed the broken pieces inside. Amara sang. The tree glowed. The soil sealed itself. And the ground finally felt still. As they walked back into Duma days later, the village gathered to greet them. The elders already knew. They had felt the mimic's death like a ripple across the land. Chief Bamadil met Grace with tears in his eyes. The fire was not the end, he said. It was only the start of light. Grace embraced him. That night, they lit 12 lanterns and placed them in the branches of the love tree. One for each guardian. One for each truth. David sat beside his mother under the stars. Do you think they'll all say yes? He asked. Grace looked up at the sky, where a gentle wind stirred the branches. They won't have to, she said. Why? Because when pain meets truth, the world doesn't stay the same. He leaned on her shoulder. Will it ever be over? Grace smiled sadly. Not over. Just healed. And far across the world, on mountain peaks and desert sands, in sleeping cities and forgotten lands. 9 more lights began to glow. The 12 were waking. And this time, they would rise together.